again, welcome. And like I said, we're starting off this week, picking up where we left off last week with early policing in the United States. So as far as policing in the United States, colonial America, obviously our nation was started with colony, right? British colonies. They, for the most part, relied heavily on self-policing. Of course, you had the British government and British, soldiers still in the colonies at that time. But for the most part, each colony, each community really policed themselves. They would elect a mayor, and then the mayor would kind of dictate how the colony was going to be run, and which laws were adopted and things like that. But for the most part, it wasn't an official city police force or anything like that. It was more just self-policing. And then, of course, you did have the British government and the British soldiers there for any radical, extreme, transgressors of the law that needed to be dealt with in that sense. But for the most part, the communities policed themselves. Slowly, they adopted different models for law enforcement, right? And so New England had, a night watchman or a constable, which they borrowed from, from England, something similar that England had. Then the southern states adopted the office of a sheriff, which we still have today. So we still have county sheriffs. And then we had the first U.S. police forces. So the first one, you had Boston. That was all the way back in 1631. So before the United States was the United States, Boston, the city of Boston, the colony, established one of the first U.S. police forces. So it was just 6 men that would guard the city. So nothing, crazy. They're just 6 guys that the city decided, you know what, we need safety and security for our city. So we're going to establish a system where we have certain people that it's their role and their job to watch the city. And so you had that in Boston and New York. Also in the 1600s, it was like 1653, New York established a kind of a police force, and they were the first ones that had like a 24-hour police force, so around the clock, because obviously crime happens all the time. So New York started with that, and then LA was also one of the first cities in the United States to have a police force. I have to mention slave patrols. That happened around the 1700s. So as I'm sure all of you are very familiar with, slavery is a huge part of our history, a terrible stain on our history, especially when you consider just some of our great documents. We're going to talk about the Declaration of Independence today, and how, we declare, all men are created equal and are endowed with these certain rights from their creator. But at the time that was written, most people did not recognize, or did not, for whatever reason, have the understanding that applied to all men, right? Not just the white men, but the Native Americans who were there, and the black slaves, and women even, right? Women were excluded from that early on in our country too. So a lot of really dark stains on our country, and slavery being the largest, of course. So slave patrols kind of got established around the 1700s because, again, slavery was the law of the land, right? Slavery was legal. It was basically the primary economy of the southern colonies and the southern, eventually the southern states, but at that time they're still colonies. Is you had slave owners with plantations and a whole bunch of slaves that were doing all of the labor, and that was what they had. And so, and of course, that was legal and is accepted in the community, which is obviously sad. And it's hard for us now in 2020 to understand how that was even possible, how that was allowed, but it was. And so trying to put yourself in the position of back then, that was allowed and that was common. And so even people who didn't necessarily approve of slavery, they still were complicit with it, in the sense that they didn't necessarily fight against it or try to stop it. So interesting times. But yeah, so slave patrols, those were established. Basically, it was, the plantation owners, they didn't want to lose their slaves, right? Obviously, slaves didn't like being slaves. They wanted their freedom, and they would try to escape slavery, escape bondage, and get free. And so the plantation owners were like, hey, this isn't good that we have runaway slaves that's bad for our business. And so they established these slave patrols. And basically it was white men whose job was to find slaves who run away and stop them from running away, and bring them back to their owners. And they also were, given authority. Again, slaves had very few rights anyway, but these slave patrols were given authority to go into the slaves' homes and make sure, and break up meetings if the slaves were trying to get together and come together, because obviously there's strength in numbers, right? And so the plantation owners and the slavers, they feared that and didn't want that to happen. So they had to say, hey, break up these meetings between slaves. We don't want them to get together and come together and revolt against us. So that was kind of their role. So there are some today that look back at these slave patrols and would suggest that that is almost like a foundation of our current law enforcement system, and that those basically just continued and then evolved into our current police. And so just like the slave patrols oppressed Black men and women, and their whole role was just to keep Black people oppressed and under subjugation, they feel like that's just evolved into our current law enforcement system and our current criminal justice system. And that's what the police today are. They're basically just the slave patrols, and their purpose and their goal is still just to oppress Black men and women and keep the Black people down. I don't find a lot of evidence for that particular theory in reading up on it and studying it, but it is it's still a valid sociological study and thing to look at. I think it's pretty clear that the slave patrols pretty much died off and were located just in the South. And after slavery, after slavery was abolished and everything, that kind of role was done away with. And the evolution of our city police and our federal agencies and all that stuff, I don't see any connection to them with the slave patrols of the 1700s. I think it's very much a different thing. And so I don't think that's really accurate history or accurate connection, saying that our current police are just connected to slave patrols. But some people do think that, so I wanted to mention it here, just because if you go on in criminal justice, you might read that in some different places too. And there's some really smart people that think that and make those arguments, but more people disagree and see a different correlation or connection there. So in the 1850s, you had the evolution of the city police. And then also, for several hundred years, you had a vigilante movement. And when you think of vigilantes, obviously I think of Batman, right? So Batman is, the most famous vigilante. And basically that's the idea of, okay, a vigilante takes the law into their own hands, and they seek out justice on their own. And that's kind of what settlers did, especially as our nation was moving from, East Coast, and we were expanding to the West, moving out West, and settlers were claiming land. For the most part, settlers were getting out West way before, government or, cities or mayors or things like that were established. You just had colonizers that were moving out West. And so the settlers, for the most part, kind of were vigilantes in the sense of that they took the law into their own hands and dealt with things on their own. So, but of course, as our populations grew and our cities developed, and the communities got bigger and populations got bigger, then with more organized society, you end up having the need for a more organized law enforcement agency. So that's when you end up having more law enforcement agencies developed. This is just interesting, talking about the history of law enforcement. You could go back to like investigators and detectives all the way back into the 1800s. Alan Pinkerton was the first detective in Chicago, and he'd established the whole, detective agency. And that's just interesting to think about, kind of some of the tactics they used even back, almost 200 years ago are still used today, right? Those things were developed a long time ago. The idea of like surveillance methods, doing undercover work and stuff like that. That's, we've come a long way in how we do that kind of work in law enforcement, but it's something, techniques and things that have been used for a long time. So interesting there. Your book talks a lot about the establishment of federal agencies. So the federal government really blew up in the in the idea of establishing law enforcement agencies, right? We primarily just talk about city police, and in law enforcement we think of city police, but within the whole criminal justice system and the law enforcement entity, the federal government is humongous, right? You look at all these different federal agencies that all are within or under the umbrella of law enforcement. And so you have the Department of Justice, which of course is the chief law enforcement agency of the entire United States, right? And that's led by the Attorney General, who would be the chief law enforcement officer of the entire federal the United States system. But then you have the FBI, right, which is huge and in every state and all over the United States. You have the DEA, specifically, you know, tasked with enforcing drugs, the Drug Enforcement Administration. You have U.S. Marshals, you have Immigration and Naturalization Service, you have ICE, right, the Immigration Control and Enforcement, the Bureau of Prisons, Department of the Treasury. Interesting, you don't normally think of the Department of the Treasury as under law enforcement, but yeah, it's under, because you have all those issues of currency and theft and security of finances. And so yeah, the Department of the Treasury comes under that umbrella of law enforcement as well. You have Bureau of Customs, IRS, Secret Service, the ATF. It's actually the ATFE now. It's the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives. But yeah, you have that. It's a whole federal division focused just on firearms, explosives, alcohol, tobacco, those things. So and enforcing those and regulating those things. And we could go on and on. The list of federal agencies is huge, and several of these agencies have lots of other agencies, you know, smaller ones underneath their umbrella, and it kind of expands like that. So what you guys need to know is just how large our system is, and which makes sense because our country's humongous, and there's the complexities of the society that we live in today is huge. This screen doesn't even mention Homeland Security, counterterrorism, all that stuff. That's all other federal agencies that have been established as well under the umbrella of criminal justice and law enforcement. And then of course you also have state agencies. So the last slide was federal agencies. So we have different levels of law enforcement, right? You have federal agencies, you have state agencies, and then you have county agencies, and then all the way down to city police, right? So we have all these different layers of law enforcement, and the Constitution of the United States actually allows and authorizes all of these different entities to have law enforcement powers. So you have federal powers, then you have state, you know, county, city, all the different levels. And of course, it's interesting when you have conflict between them, right? And this happens all the time, and it's happening today, where I think one of the biggest one is on immigration, right? So you have the federal government saying, hey, we need to secure our borders. Immigration is illegal. We need to deal with the illegal immigrants, or the immigrants who are coming into our country illegally, and prosecute them because they're committing a crime. They came into the country illegally and they should be prosecuted. So you have that perspective from the federal government. But then you have states who are saying, no, actually, I don't agree with that. The federal government can say that the immigrants are illegal, but from our perspective as a state, we're saying, no, they're not illegal. We're not going to arrest them. We're not going to prosecute them. We're not going to do anything about it. And so you have a conflict there between what the federal law enforcement is saying versus what the state or local law enforcement is saying. Same thing happens with drugs, right? According to the federal government, you know, marijuana is still illegal, but we have several states now in the United States who have legalized marijuana. So which is it? Is it legal or is it not illegal? And you just have different jurisdictions with different laws that are actually in conflict. So a real fascinating thing to consider and look at with the different levels of agencies. As far as state agencies go, there are state police. There is a California state police. We don't see them very often. Their jurisdiction is a little bit different. Where you'll actually see them most is actually at Cal State Fullerton. So Cal State Fullerton, the university, they have their own police department on the Cal State Fullerton campus. And they fall under the state police because they are at a state university. So they're not city police. They're not from the city of Fullerton. They're not from Orange County. They're actually state police. So they're They work for the state and they work at Cal State Fullerton. But the ones you'll see most often are actually the highway patrols, right? So California Highway Patrol, CHP, they are a state run law enforcement agency, and they have jurisdiction over all the highways in California. So up and down the entire coast of California, you have the California Highway Patrol, and pretty much most other states also have highway patrols that are state-run agencies. And then, like the Texas Rangers, they're probably the most famous because they were, the first agency that were similar to kind of our state police. They were specifically worked for the state. They were a state law enforcement agency for all of Texas. And then moving on, we have county agencies. So that's typically the county sheriff, right? So that's me. I work for the Orange County Sheriff's Department. We have jurisdiction over Orange County. And some of the main roles, at least today, and functions for the county sheriffs are the county jail. That's a big one. So keeping the county jail, and also enforcing court orders and keeping county courts. So typically, doesn't matter what city you run into trouble with the law in, you're going to end up in a county jail and going to a county court to settle your case. And so that is all run by the county sheriff. It comes under the sheriff's department jurisdiction. And then we talked a little bit about the coroner and medical examiner too, also underneath the county and under the county's jurisdiction. Tribal law enforcement, your book talks a little bit about this. I won't go into much detail because honestly, it's not something we really deal with, but we do have Native American tribes within our country. We don't really see or talk about a lot. Mostly we'll only hear about, Indian casinos or things like that. But there are certain lands that, reservations or lands that are, where certain Native American tribes have their own jurisdiction, their own authority, and they have their own law enforcement even within their tribe. So that's really unique and would be fascinating to study if you're interested in, Native American life and studies like that, but not particularly relevant to us here in Orange County. And then your book goes on to talk about traditional eras of policing. And this is very history focused, kind of takes a big picture look at, the United States and the different eras we've had where police, they look at, the development of law enforcement and things like that. And so they say, okay, well, at first it was very political. Police was all about politics, and it was very much tied to politics and things like that. But then, after the Great Depression, so starting around the 1930s, there was reform, and it kind of became more professional. So it was less like a political office, law enforcement, but it was more like a professional. We're hiring professionals to do professional work of law enforcement. And so the kind of the focus of law enforcement changed during those years. And then what we talked a lot about already in this class is the community era. And so that's kind of from 1980 to present. And that's, again, community policing. The emphasis is on partnering with the community, doing problem-solving policing, and more doing partnerships and working together with the community, and the police are part of the community in working to solve problems and reduce crime and things like that. And then your book also talks about kind of a fourth era that's kind of emerging, that's, those super smart people that study law enforcement and study criminology and criminal justice, they really identify, we're kind of getting into a fourth era, and that was ever since the September 11th attacks on the United States back in 2001, that this is we're more international almost focused, and we're focused on like homeland security, and we're looking at intelligence and predictive policing, evidence-based and things like that. And even just in local law enforcement, we're focused more on, risk assessment and risk management, which dictates how we do our business. And how we conduct ourselves and how we move forward. So that's kind of an emerging fourth era, but you could look in your textbook for a little bit more about that. But that finishes up chapter 1. So let me stop recording there and